to the students. It's a good thing it's a little breezy today because the sun is very inviting, isn't it? We have a very special program today. The first thing that we're going to do is this is the Robert Harris Memorial Lecture, in which we honor the founder of the Alliance for the Study of the Holocaust and one of the people who was very, very important in starting the whole program at Sonoma State. His photo is up here. I want to introduce the president of the Alliance for the Study of the Holocaust and Genocide at Sonoma State University. You've seen her here before. She is going to tell you a bit about Robert, a very special person, and then talk about people in our community who we have unfortunately lost this year. So, Christine?
Okay, brace yourselves. Sorry. Okay. Good afternoon, everybody. First, I want to welcome everybody, of course, including the students here today. I want to thank Dean Leda for being here today. Thank you very much. And of course, Dr. Berenbaum for being here today. We do appreciate your coming on this very special lecture. I want to also recognize some of the past Alliance board members here today. Joel Newberg, who's in the back there, raise your hand, thank you. Barbara, raise your hand. Barbara Tobin right here. And Barbara Lesh McCaffrey, who's on our current board right here today, raise your hand, thank you very much. And I also want to thank those of you from the community who took the time out to come here. There's many of you in the audience and many of you who are Holocaust survivors, so I really do appreciate you being here today. And Dennis is here with Lily and Judd, and they have a wonderful display outside, and it's about her new book, so do see that on the way out. Okay. Today is the Robert L. Harris Memorial Lecture. Robert L. Harris was a World War II vet who had retired and moved with his wife Claire to Sonoma County after a distinguished career in school teaching and administration, which included directing a school for troubled youth. He became active in the Jewish community and decided that a contribution he could make was to ensure that all students at all levels were educated about the Holocaust. At an event in remembrance of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising had been done for years by a group in Petaluma, which then became an annual Yom HaShoah commemoration. The group included Simon Jaffe and Joe Rappaport, who had emigrated from Europe and were in the U.S. during World War II, and Irv Newman, who had been coordinating the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising event. At the Yom HaShoah event held right here at the Sonoma State Commons in 1983, the university president, Peter, Diamandopoulos, thank you, was keynote speaker. After the event, he challenged Robert, who was that year's coordinator, to do more than just memorialize the Holocaust annually at an event that began the University Community Partnership. Part of the justification for founding the group was training teachers. It soon became apparent that Sonoma State was an ideal place for a permanent program about the Holocaust. Professor Steiner, a Holocaust survivor, professor of sociology, had begun to teach classes that dealt with issues related to the Holocaust. In addition, Paul Banco, a Holocaust survivor, was a faculty member in the biology department, and George Jackson, a liberator, was faculty member in the psychology department. During the spring of 1983, Robert Harris asked a number of people, including Professor Banco, to assist him in responding to the president's challenge. One of the first was Joel Newberg, right back there, who was working at the Holocaust Library and Research Center in San Francisco, which was established in 1978 by survivors. The center had sponsored lectures, but not a consistent program. He also invited Sylvia Zucker, a retired teacher who had recently moved to the area from New York. She knew Robert's wife Claire through her volunteer work with Hadassah. One of Professor Steiner's first students, Virgil Miller, who had been attending the Warsaw Ghetto memorial events, was also invited to join the initial group. Robert had added ministers, rabbis, and people like Evelyn Evie Sackler, another of Professor Steiner's students, Eugene Kravis, Irv Newman, from Petaluma Group, and another local survivor, Walter Kuttner. Sylvia Zucker remembers Robert Harris as an infatigable leader with enormous determination who was able to work with all types of people, an inspiration. As Joel Norberg recalls, Robert was a one-person organization. He knew what needed to be done, how to interface with individuals and groups, and how to handle all the fundraising. He simply would ask people, and people would donate. The Alliance for the Study of the Holocaust was formed on behalf of the victims and survivors of the Holocaust and desired to tell their stories and learn from their experiences. Those who began this collaborative effort between the community and members of Sonoma State University faculty promised to let the world know of the atrocities had occurred. The initial intention was primarily to learn the facts, act on them, and never forget. As a result of these efforts, a highly successful lecture series on the Holocaust and genocide was created at the university that was initially 5 to 6 lectures a year and grew into a general education course that currently enrolls 100 students annually, as you all know. Professor Steiner became the first director of the Center for the Study of the Holocaust at Sonoma State, and Professor Myrna Goodman, then a returning student working toward her bachelor's degree, was the first student assistant hired by the center. Almost from its inception, the series had included lectures on other genocides as well as the Holocaust. As a university community partnership, the board now includes members of the community, university faculty, administrators, and students who have participated in the lecture series. Its current mission is to co-sponsor the lecture series, support the Center for the Study of the Holocaust and Genocide and programming to the community at large, and to collaborate with other community groups working on issues related to Holocaust and genocide. After Robert's death, the members of the Alliance decided to name an annual lecture in this series as a tribute to his unswerving dedication and commitment to Holocaust education. We are truly indebted to Robert for his vision and his leadership. For those of you interested in this series, now in its 28th year, there is a binder that will be on stage. Oh, I'm sorry, I don't have the binder. I apologize. It has a binder in the flyers. My apologies. I'll bring it next week for the students to see. Sorry about that. Anyway, I wanted to say it on a personal note. You know, it's really amazing, this series, how Myrna programs it every single year. It's been an amazing year. There's still more amazing lectures this year, and I think that I hope that you all appreciate the years that it took to get to where it is today, and I just think it's amazing, and I hope that it's been have a lasting memory for all of you. Okay, so now we're going to move on to the memorials, and if we could show Vern. There we go. There we go. Okay. This is Vern Dremel. Vern was born in Hamburg, Germany in 1929. He was sent to a transition ghetto in 1943, shortly after his father's death. His mother was hospitalized at the time and was killed 2 months later. The following year, he was sent to Auschwitz. By pretending he was a craftsman, he was sent to a satellite camp in Gleichwitz 2 months later, where he worked as a lathe operator. He says that my physical survival was purely a matter of luck. My survival as a human being, I attribute to my relationship with one person just 9 years older than myself, but intellectually, philosophically, and politically very mature. He shared his convictions about freedom, democracy, human rights with me. I became convinced that the Nazi regime could not possibly end victorious. While I might not be there to see it, it would end up in ignominy. When the Russians commenced their final offensive in January 1945, 7 of those who initially met in the transition ghetto, able to escape into nearby woods during a moment of panic among our guards, on V-Day found all 7 in Bucharest. They made their way back to Western Europe, found none of their relatives, established a DP center in Bavaria, and the following year were able to enter the U.S. Vern says the unbelievable generosity of an American family facilitated his Americanization and an increasing sense of belonging. Vern says that giving unasked advice seems presumptuous. What I do believe is that we are all human beings regardless of nationality, religion, or ideology. As such, we are capable of unbelievable nobility as well, unfortunately, as the extreme opposite. Among my most highly regarded heroes are the righteous Gentiles who risked their lives saving people during the Holocaust, and I ask myself, would I have been capable of the same? I'm sorry?
When did he pass?
Oh, I'm sorry. He passed in January of this year. Sorry. Michael Burks. Here we go. Michael Burks was born in Haifa in 1927 and moved back and forth from Transylvania to Haifa, where he spent the happiest years of his life there. When troubles with the Arabs started in 1936, his family moved back to Transylvania. The day they sailed from Haifa was one of the saddest of his life. It took him years to get over the trauma of that program and the outrageousness that followed. The shock of being free and then persecuted within less than 1 month's time was almost unbearable, he says. When Romania joined the Nazis and declared war on the USSR, the Nazi military advisors arrived, and for the first time he saw the black uniforms with silver skull and crossbones of the SS death worshippers. Jews were expelled from public schools, Jewish schools were closed and buildings confiscated. Secret schools were organized in the basements of private homes. He says that some of the best teachers in Romania were Jewish. Since they were expelled, we received, in spite of everything, probably the best education available in anywhere occupied Europe at the time. At 16, he was put in a volunteer battalion, sent to road clearing work after bombings. He ended up with emphysema from the bombs and double scoliosis from the heavy burdens they had to carry. He says, we were not allowed to leave the target areas to take refuge. Many times our soup kitchen could not get through. Enough water fit for humans was not given us while forced to do hard labor in 110-degree weather of the oil fields. We were liberated by the Soviets in 1944 and knew nothing about the fate of our family in Hungary until the end of the war, when we found that but only a few aunts and cousins in Europe and our family in Israel were the only survivors. Michael went on to earn his degree in Prague with both a master's and Ph.D. He also learned a dozen languages that were useful in his future. When sustained, Michael was the memory of being free in Israel, unafraid of even Arab attacks, strong and sure that I was a valuable human being surrounded by my own kind. Our strength came from knowing that it was us, it was, all for one and one for all, and that our right to life and liberty were not negotiable. Although only a child, it was a lesson well learned and that no one can ever take away from me. And I'm sorry, Michael's passing was also in January of this year. Henry Hughes. Oh, by the way, these bios that I'm reading to you actually come by way mostly of Barbara Lesh McCaffrey from when we had a Holocaust survivor event. I think it's been 4 years now, 1996. And we had students who helped collect these bios and photographs, so that's why we are able to read these to you today. Henry Hughes was in his early teens when Nazis came to power. After Kristallnacht, Henry's father was rounded up by the Gestapo and deported to, Sachsenhausen concentration camp and incarcerated for 5 weeks. Citing his exemplary military service with the German army during the First World War with an Iron Cross as evidence, his father was released. Once home, Henry's father, taking no chances, made the decision to emigrate from Germany. Immigration laws were severe, so emigrating to the United States was not an option. Henry's father, realizing this great obstacle, saw opportunity to flee to Shanghai, China with his family and chose that route. Meanwhile, Henry's sister was able to find her way out of Germany by means of a kinder transport to Great Britain. In 1948, Henry came to the United States, where he initially lived in Palo Alto and San Francisco. In 1942, his parents, who emigrated to England, joined him in California. In 1956, he moved to Daly City and eventually married and employed by the federal government. Henry believes that he is lucky and fortunate to have survived the Holocaust, and maintains that one must fight anti-Semitism wherever you find it. His passing, I'm sorry.
September of this year.
September of last
2010.
2010, right. Thank you. Ava? Eva Prager was born in California but lived in Budapest, Hungary from 1930 to 1947. Anti-Semitism had a full bloom in all of her life, but the real trouble started when the Germans occupied Hungary at the end of 1944. Eva lived with her mother in Hungary and was hidden with her by their Gentile neighbor when the Jews were dragged out of their homes to be deported. Without good Gentiles, they would not have survived. They ran from place to place, were bombed out of buildings, and only survived by luck. In 1947, Ava returned to the United States and became a psychiatric social worker. She retired in 1996 and moved to Santa Rosa 2 years later. Her advice is to give others is to run when trouble begins. And she passed November of 2010. And Bill? We're going to be speaking about Bill today because we believe he was a very great supporter of the Memorial Grove. I believe that's right. So, Bill was a founding member of Congregation Shir Shalom and was instrumental in bringing the Torah to them. Bill and his wife Fern were members of the Emmanuel in city and also maintained their membership with Congregation Shir Shalom. I take it that was in the city, right? Yeah, okay. He was born in Ostrach, Germany. He was the only survivor of his immediate family. His mother, father, and sister all perished in Auschwitz. His family fled Germany to Holland in 1936 after experiencing an increasing amount of anti-Semitism. Bill's family was sent to Westerbork concentration camp in Holland in 1942. He was then sent by himself to Auschwitz-Birkenau at the end of 1942, where he stayed until the spring of 1943. He was sent to the Warsaw Ghetto after the uprising, where he was forced to do slave labor, destroying buildings, burning bodies, and searching for valuables for the German army. From Warsaw, Bill was sent to Dachau and then to Kopring camp. He was liberated on April 30th, 1945 by the American Army. Feeling a great debt to the U.S. Army, Bill later went on to serve the Army during the Korean War after starting with only $10 in his pocket. When arriving to the United States, Bill went on to create a successful real estate company in San Francisco. He dedicated his life to Holocaust remembrance and education. He's the co-founder of the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, D.C. He was a prominent philanthropist, supporter of Shir Zadok Medical Center in Jerusalem, and of course of our Memorial Grove here at Sonoma State. And his passing was April of 2011. And Alexander Kameni. This is Dr. Alexander Kameni. He is the husband of Mathilde Mukandabana, who has spoken very often here for the Tutsi genocide of Rwanda. She has also been a board member for a number of years of the Alliance. I would like to let you know that he was a professor of ethnic studies at Cal State University, Sacramento. He was a founding member of the Friends of Rwanda Association and a great mentor to many. Dr. Kameni was a renowned African linguist, an accomplished scholar, prolific writer, poet, advisor of justice, and activist in struggle to end the Rwandan genocide, educator of global understanding and prevention of genocide and human rights violations. He was a really great supporter of the Alliance here at Sonoma State. And I do want to read you from our electronic means. From Mathilde, she apologized she could not be here today, but she wanted me to mention that his tombstone says, He saw pain, he tried to heal it. He saw wrong, and he tried to right it. And I just want to say in closing that what I presented here were the lives of some really amazing people, and throughout difficulty, they were able to become really great human beings. Thank you.
It is now my honor to tell you a bit about our speaker for today. We could call him Dr. Berenbaum, or we could call him Rabbi Berenbaum. His vita stretches probably to 20 pages. He's written over, how much is it? 15 books. He's been the historical consultant the chief historical consultant on several movies and films, which you already know or have seen, including Conspiracy, Uprising. He was the writer and chief historian on Resistance, which was made by Warner Brothers, the writer and historian on The Desperate Hours. He was a consultant on Defiance, and also a historical consultant on Miss Irena's Children, which was about a Hallmark Hall of Fame production on Irena Sendler. He has degrees from Queens College, the Jewish Theological Seminary, Hebrew University, Boston University, Florida State University is where he got his Ph.D. He is the founding director of research at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. He joined the President's Commission in 1979. I could go on. I don't want to take away from his remarks. I would just like you to know that I believe, and I don't think there's anybody who would argue with me, that Dr. Michael Berenbaum is the foremost historian of the Holocaust in the United States, and it's our great pleasure that he looks kindly on us and comes to speak to us. So would you welcome Dr. Berenbaum?
Thank you very much, Myrna, for an overly kind introduction. There's only one advantage to the introduction, which is that my college roommate is here, and he knows better. But we had I say this for the students, which is that you will really find that one of the great privileges, I know you guys want to grow older to mature, but one of the great privileges of growing older is to have people who have shared with you most of life's journey. And if you're privileged to have people who have shared with you most of life's journey. So on my way up here, we stopped in to see his youngest son defend his master's thesis. I was a little bit late, but my mother used to say, you can call him anything, but don't call him late for dinner. And we saw that, and it's always a pleasure to be with Murray, but he would not have called me such honorific titles. But really one of the great privileges of life is to have people with whom you've shared life over many generations. I want to do three very different things today with you. First of all, we have to be mindful of the day on which we meet, and also mindful in a very real way on the season in which we meet. I want to talk to you about some dramatic changes in the field of Holocaust studies that are going to impact upon the way in which we study the Holocaust in the future, and also the context in which we speak about the Holocaust, and then talk a little bit about some of the problematics in the field which is about to undergo a dramatic transition, and then leave myself open for lots of questions. We're meeting on a very special day We're meeting on what is now the 63rd anniversary of the birth of the State of Israel, which means that we're meeting at a time in which in the Jewish calendar, and the Jewish calendar, remember, is the oldest, along with the Chinese calendar, it's the oldest calendar known in human history. But the irony, of course, is the Jewish calendar had not undergone transformation for centuries, and then in the 20th century it underwent two major transformations. One was the introduction of Holocaust Memorial Day, and the other is the introduction of today, which is Israel Independence Day. And both of these are very interesting, transformative events. I want to talk for one moment about Holocaust Remembrance Day because it's going to tell you something that we'll touch on in a moment with regard to transitions in Holocaust studies. There was a debate, when do you remember the Holocaust? In one sense, you can say that every day was Holocaust Remembrance Day because the Holocaust is a very distinct event that evolved over 12 years and then developed in a very dramatic way from 1941 onward. And the question then became, how do you choose a day upon which to remember the Holocaust? Earlier than that was an even more interesting question, which is, whose calendar is it to be remembered on? And that is it to be remembered in secular time, meaning in world historical time, because the Holocaust is an event that happened to Jews in which Jews were not the authors of it, but in very deep ways the victims of it. And if you were going to do it, then what date would you choose to remember the Holocaust? Example, do you choose January 30th because in 1933, January 30th was the day upon which Hitler came to power? No Hitler, no Holocaust. January 30th has a compelling reason for it. Do you choose September 15th because in 1935, that's the date upon which Jews were defined? Nazi policy had been deeply and profoundly anti-Semitic, but it never came to an articulation as to who were the Jews, and only once it articulated who were the Jews could it use the legal system to persecute, isolate, systematically destroy the Jews, and do so all within the confines of legality. First of those major laws to be passed was the law of September 15th, 1935. Could you choose November 9th? Because November 9th in 1938 was the beginning of Kristallnacht, which is the fancy way in which we remember the November 1938 pogroms, in which 1,000 synagogues were destroyed, 7,000 Jewish businesses were looted, and 30,000 Jewish men aged 16 to 60 were sent off to concentration camps. It was, as historians like to refer to, the end of the beginning and the beginning of the end. Do you choose September 1 because in 1939 that was the date, the very important date upon which World War II began? And wartime permits lots of things to take place under the fog of war, the cloud of war, the urgency of war, which would not have been allowed to take place otherwise. In fact, the letter from Hitler authorizing the murder of the mentally retarded, physically infirm, emotionally distraught is backdated to September 1st to give it the appearance of a wartime measure. And that, ironically, is the first time that the Germans developed gassing, which ultimately enveloped the Jews. And I'm deliberately using non-PC language because you can't say that the Germans victimized Germans of special needs or Germans who were challenged. We have to use that nomenclature. Would you then say June 21, 41, because that's June 21, because in 1941, that's the day upon which, That's the day upon which the killing of Jews began in earnest. Or would you say January 20th, because in January 20th, 1942, well, let me put it to you this way. There was a conference on January 20th, 1942. It was a conference of 15 men, 8 of whom had doctorates. They were what we of the Vietnam generation would call the best and the brightest. And it was at that moment that they met, and let me set the context for you. 2 of them were above 50, most were in their 30s and 40s. They had come very far, very fast. As they met, 4 of 5 Jews who were to die in the Holocaust were still alive. Within 15 months, the figure was reversed, and 4 or 5 of the Jews who were being murdered in the Holocaust were already dead. So if you want to understand what happened at that moment, you have to look at January 20th and say that is the pivotal moment at which a transition is made. And if you were to take my course on the Holocaust, you would understand that that's the very interesting moment at which they made a dramatic change that made the Holocaust possible and made it, relatively speaking, simple. What was that change? First 6 months of killing Jews, they sent mobile killers to stationary victims. Town by town, village by village, hamlet by hamlet, person by person. They were called mobile killers, Einsatzgruppen. And they walked into a town, they rounded up the Jews, they took them to a valley, to a wadi, to the edge of the city, and they shot them. This became problematic for the killers because it became difficult for them to spend every day, all day, shooting men, women, and children. Many had breakdowns. Many started drinking. Sometimes they drank afterwards for rewards. They then drank before and during. And on January 20th, 1942, they came to a conclusion: let's reverse it. What is the reversal? And this is the key to understanding what happened over the next 3 years. If you cannot send mobile killers to stationary victims, you reverse the process. You make the victims mobile and you send them to stationary killing centers. The apparatus by which you made the victims mobile was the railroad car. And the killing centers were factories of death, the combination of the assembly line pioneered by the great American Henry Ford and Darwin's notion of survival of the fittest, in which you decimate those you deem unfit, unworthy of life. That's the transition moment. So in one sense, if you want to understand what's unique about the Holocaust, you have to begin to think of that. Or do we make it January 27th, because on January 27th, 1945, that's the day upon which Auschwitz was liberated. It ironically is the day and it was liberated by the Soviet armies. It's ironically the day that the world is now choosing to commemorate in their time as the International Day of Holocaust Remembrance. Ironically, not May 8th, which is the day that World War II came to an end, but January 27th, when Auschwitz was evacuated, when Auschwitz was liberated. And the irony is we now know that most of the victims of Auschwitz had already been sent to the West before January 27th on what became known as the death marches. So the question becomes, do you commemorate the Holocaust in secular time, or then do you commemorate in Jewish time? And the Israeli parliament, which debated this, then said, what time do you choose? And they chose to commemorated on the day closest that they could come to the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. And the problem with the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising as a day of Holocaust commemoration is the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising was the second day of Passover. It was April 19th, 1943, the second night of Passover. And the whole reason that the Jews were being evacuated from Warsaw is because April 20th, 1933 was April 20th every year was Hitler's birthday. And the Germans wanted to make a present to Hitler of destroying the largest Jewish city in all of Europe. And they juxtaposed April 19th, which was Passover, with April 20th of Hitler's birthday. But the problem is you couldn't deal with, at the very same moment, you couldn't deal with all of the liberation that is associated with Passover, and also with all of the tragedy and atrocity that's associated with the Holocaust. So the Israeli authorities compromised, and they chose a date after Passover that was closest to the ghetto uprising. And it turned out to be 8 days earlier, 8 days before the anniversary of the State of Israel. So if you live in Jewish time, you go ironically from liberation to the anti-liberation that represents the passage from freedom onto slavery, the revelation of the anti-God and the anti-humanity that we experienced at Auschwitz. And then you experience the peculiar and painful marvels of Jewish history, which is that 3 years after such catastrophe, you had a rebirth and a rejuvenation of Jewish life. So that's the rhythm you live in if you live in Jewish time at this very particular season of the year. Let me now switch for a moment. And let me switch for a moment and talk about a couple of dramatic changes in the field of Holocaust studies. First change I want to deal with is going to be a little bit graphic, so I hope you can bear with me because there's only a physicality to it that you have to talk to. There's a marvelous and very important Roman Catholic priest roaming around Eastern Europe by the name of Father Patrick Dubois. And Father Patrick Dubois is the child of French parents who were Nazi resistors, who told their son, remember what these people have done. He then, over the last 8 or 9 years, has been going throughout Eastern Europe and meeting with not survivors, but witnesses to the mobile killing and mobile slaughtering. Because he wears a Roman Catholic Church garb and the priest's collar, many of them take the opportunity to confess to him. They saw something when they were very young people, 8, 9, 10, 11. Remember, these are events that occurred in 1941. So if you were 11 at that point, you today are 80. If you were 8, you're 78. If you were 14, you're 84. He then does one other thing which is very interesting, which is that he goes and he digs up the mass graves. And when he digs up the mass graves, he's finding a couple of things that are very important. And here's where we get a little bit graphic and a little bit interesting. One of the things he finds, which we don't ordinarily think of as historical evidence, is he finds keys. Now think for a moment about what a key represents as historical evidence. Is there anybody here who's not carrying a key? What does it mean that you carry a key? It meant that you left home this morning or this afternoon, and you fully expect what? To go home tonight, and you fully expect your home to what? To be there and to be untouched. It means you expect a certain measure of safety and normalcy. Now, all of you who drive cars have what to your car? Keys, or today you have these, these little flashers, these little kings. But what is the thing about a car? Is you left it, you expect it to be there when you come back. And the irony is, any of us who have ever had a car stolen, what? Understand that when we come back and it's not there, we believe what? We made a mistake, we can't remember where we parked it. The world is not that the car disappeared and somebody took it, but what? We can't remember where we parked it. And to tell you the truth, you normally park somewhere where you've parked before 100 times before. Because you go to places that are familiar and your first instinct is, I misplaced my car. But a key as evidence means that you expected when you left home that morning what? To be safe and secure and to return home at night. So the fact that you died with your keys, or were murdered with your keys, meant in a certain sense you did not believe what was about to happen to you, and you didn't imagine that it was capable of happening. He then discovers a couple of other things that become critical to understanding what happened. Number two, he discovers bullets. Now you've seen enough police on television to what? To understand that what? That bullets are essential for forensic evidence. But remember what bullets are. Bullets tell you who the killers were. It tells you if the killers were the army. It tells you if the killers were the SS units that had different types of bullets that were given to them. It tells you if they were Romanian or German army units, or even Hungarian army units. It also tells you, for example, if they were local gendarmerie, because the police had different bullets than we might buy in Sears or in Walmart. And it tells you in what villages and areas it was not the police, not the gendarmerie, not the army, not the other allied armies, Axis armies with the Germans who did the killing, but what? But the local populace that killed. And we all know those of us in the field know the very interesting research that was done by Jan Gross of the village of Jedwabne in Poland, in which he wrote a book called Neighbors, in which the citizens of Jedwabne used the excuse of the Germans being in the vicinity of Jedwabne to kill their own Jews in order to possess and inherit their property. As it were, the reverse of the admonition of the prophet, Haratzachta v'gam yarashta, have you murdered and also inherited? They chose to murder in order to inherit. And what he's finding in very many respects is something quite remarkable, which is that in many villages, it wasn't that Jedwabne was an isolated case, but in many villages, the killers were neighbors, not Germans, not Nazis, not uniformed soldiers, not gendarmerie, but plain people who saw that this was an opportunity to go on a rampage and to profit as well as to plunder, and to profit by plunder as well as to murder. Discovered one other thing which tells you a little bit about the victims. He discovered that there are many bodies that have disintegrated, skeletons that have no bullet holes in them, no damage. Now that means that there were cases in which Parents, as they were being shot, put their kids in front of them, and as they were being shot, they took the bullet for their kids, fell in the ground on their kids. Husbands did that for wives, wives did that for husbands, parents did that for children, perhaps a few occasions, children even for their parents. Now this comports with one other piece of historical evidence. If you read the accounts of the Einsatzgruppen murders from the townsmen, they say something very remarkable and very painful. They say that the ground continued to move for several days. We always regarded that as poetic, or as bodies expanding and bodies contracting, because after you die there is a certain type of constriction that takes place. Gases escape and all of that. But it could be that that's not what they saw. What they saw were the endeavor of the people underneath to climb out from their death. And the literal moving of the ground was precisely people struggling for air pockets and for places in which they could what? They could escape. And the only recollections we have of people who actually faced the Einsatzgruppen were people who either jumped into the mass graves and pretended to be dead, or found in one sense that they were not shot, and consequently because they were not shot, they were able to crawl out if somebody heavy did not fall upon them, if they weren't, down at the bottom of a large pile, and they became the eyewitnesses to this precisely because they could escape. He's discovering one other thing which is very interesting. He's discovering the different ways in which bystanders and witnesses confess to a priest. In certain areas, he is finding people who presume that because he's a priest, he supported what was done to the Jews. And they are sharing with him not because they want absolution, but because they want to talk about something that was exciting to them and interesting to them. In other areas, he finds that they're seeking to confess before they die, not to carry something into the grave with them. And there are differences in areas, differences in regions, differences in religion, and differences that he notices among the population. And what's going to be interesting also is, as he marks these mass graves, the numbers that are going to come, because we see that there's a territory seared with blood. And we only had large images of this. We never had the very particular elements of it. And we also see that a new generation is trying to do that even in a place like Romania. And Romania was a place where the Romanians did the killing and not the Germans. And the Romanians got part of the story correctly and not part of the story correctly. They mimicked the German actions, but they never built death camps, so they kept the Jews on rails until they died of starvation and death. And now we're beginning to understand where the mass graves are, and hence the number of Romanians who have been killed, and we're beginning to understand this epoch. Let me talk about another area of new research which is becoming available because of the fact in which the Holocaust has become so dramatically and vividly documented. We now have, when I was at the Survivors of the Shoah Visual History Foundation, we took 52,000 testimonies from 57 countries in 32 languages. And we amassed about 150,000 hours of testimony. There probably are another 80,000 or 90,000 hours of testimonies, and probably you have about 70 to 75,000 video histories of Holocaust survivors, which all of a sudden enable you to understand a variety of different things about an event and to reconstruct what you know and to get a sense of the ordinary life of people. Because most of history is not composed by ordinary men, but by extraordinary men and women who write memoirs, who compose documents, who are historical figures, who write letters, who do all of the things that we need to depend upon access to the past. But in this case, we have a whole variety of things that are available to us that have never been available to another generation, both in quantity, and quantity also means quality in a very deep way. Let me give you one large way in which we can talk about this. I've been working in recent years on the difference between perpetrator time and victim time. Perpetrator time is what the Nazis did, and victim time is a very different thing. It's the way in which you perceive, the way in which you experience an event. Let me give you an example of children's experience. We can all talk about what happens to kids, but how do we understand how a kid experienced persecution? Kids don't experience persecution by reading newspapers. They experience persecution in a couple of ways. Let me give you 3 or 4 quick illustrations. Child says, I fell down in the schoolyard and I cut my leg and I was bleeding. What do you do when you fall down and you cut your leg and you're bleeding in a schoolyard? What's the first thing you do? You go to your teacher. My teacher looked at me and said, I won't touch Jewish blood. All of a sudden, the biological racism that was involved with that statement becomes a concrete thing. If I'm all alone on the floor bleeding, and the person in authority will not come to me. Kids picking on me in the schoolyard. My teacher sees it and goes like this. Meaning they turn their back, which means nobody's there to help you. I worked with a very fine man by the name of Sheik Weinberg, whose life was saved by the following incident, which also speaks about victim time. His principal was an anti-Nazi, and he was beaten up in school. His father knew his principal very well from social clubs and from other experiences. He went in to speak to the principal, why is my kid in a vulnerable situation? The principal turned to him and he said to his father, he said, Mr. Weinberg, I cannot protect the safety of your child. Didn't say I don't want to protect the safety of your child. He was saying I cannot protect the safety of your child. He said the next day I was on a train from Berlin to Warsaw, and 2 weeks later I was in Palestine. My life was saved. How do you experience persecution? You experience persecution, another woman says, girl at that point. She said, I had a girlfriend. We used to sleep over each other's home. We used to come home from school and talk to each other 3 or 4 times a night on the phone. I was in her home, she was in my home. One day she says, you know, you can't come to my home anymore. My mother won't allow a Jewish child in. Not a grand perception of reality, the smallest perception of it. Even as sophisticated a man as Henry Kissinger, when he's reciting his own history, He said, when my parents left Germany, it took no foresight, merely opportunity, meaning that the question to ask at the beginning is, when did you know that the situation was not viable? When did you know, when did it dawn on you that this was not going to pass, this was going to remain, that this was going to be systematic, that this was going to be serious, that this was going to be sustained? And then what did you do? We're also discovering that if you take victims' time, you have to say that the ghetto has to be divided into 3 periods. People speak of the ghetto as if it's one moment. The ghetto actually has 3 different moments. It's the moment in which you moved into the ghetto, but when you moved into the ghetto, you still had some of your possessions, and if you were lucky, you lived in that section of the town that had been ghettoized, that section of the town in which you were in a ghetto, so you had your own apartment, your own stuff.